January 30th, 2019. Inside a modest house in Owata, Rotorua, the silence of the early morning was broken by the chilling sounds of fists slamming against flesh. Furniture scraped across the floor. A man's voice begged for his life, only to be cut off by the dull, heavy crack of a hammer striking bone. This wasn't just another act of violence in a country known more for its natural beauty than its crime. This was something deeper. This was the unfiltered reality of life inside one of New Zealand's most notorious gangs, the Mongrel Mob. For decades, the Mongrel Mob has ruled streets, controlled drug trades, and left trails of blood from Hastings to Auckland. With their unmistakable British bulldog insignia, red and black patches and ink-covered faces, they became symbols of fear and brutality across New Zealand and beyond. But behind the colours and snarling loyalty lies something far more complex. Brotherhood built on fear. Honour tied to violence. Betrayal that comes at a cost no one ever truly escapes. Tonight, we're stepping inside that world. We'll uncover the stories of 5 individuals, each carving their names into the gang's violent history, each carrying the weight of decisions that shaped their lives, destroyed others, and revealed the thin line between loyalty and survival. Where are you watching from tonight, and have you heard of the Mongrel Mob before, or is this your first time stepping into their world? Let me know in the comments, because what you're about to hear isn't just about gangsters. It's about men who lived by a code few understand and died by it more often than not. Stay with me. In the late 1960s, in the town of Hastings, a group of young men stood at the edge of society, separated from the future so many others took for granted. These were boys who grew up on the hard end of life. Boys no one expected much from. They were the ones left behind in classrooms, pushed aside in job lines, and ignored until their anger made itself known. What started as small pockets of rebellion, fists thrown in street fights, stolen cars dumped in back alleys, scrawled symbols spray-painted across abandoned walls, grew into something much larger than anyone could have predicted. They gave themselves a name that carried every ounce of their anger and every scar left by a world that never cared if they made it out alive. They called themselves the Mongrel Mob, and they weren't looking for acceptance. They were building something of their own. The Mongrel Mob wasn't built on carefully written rules or the quiet meetings of men in suits. It came together in basements, in battered cars, in cold cells, where loyalty was the only thing standing between survival and a beating that could leave you unrecognizable. What began in Hastings spread like wildfire across New Zealand, from the far north to the bottom of the South Island. And it didn't stop there. Mongrel Mob chapters appeared across Australia, bringing their reputation with them. Even in Canada, their presence made itself known. Proof that no border could contain what they had become. There's no mistaking a Mongrel Mob member, red and black wrapped around their bodies, colours worn like second skin. The British bulldogs snarling from patches sewn onto leather vests, faces covered in ink not for decoration but to declare loyalty where everyone could see it. Loyalty that ran deeper than blood. Loyalty. That's the word they held above all others. Loyalty to the brother beside you, to the colours on your back, to the crew that stood with you when no one else did. Loyalty enforced by fists, by blades, by whatever it took to remind anyone who questioned it that the price of betrayal was higher than most were willing to pay. But loyalty alone doesn't build empires. Methamphetamine poured through Mongrel Mob pipelines, feeding addictions that destroyed families, funded mansions, and left bodies in ditches when debts were called in. Intimidation wasn't an afterthought, it was currency. When Mongrel Mob showed up at a doorstep, the only options were silence or submission. This wasn't a club. It was an industry built on fear, fed by violence, and held together by a code no outsider could fully understand. But behind the ink, behind the barking, behind the chaos they unleashed on the streets, there were men. Men whose choices created everything Mongrel Mob became. Men whose stories weren't written in history books but in scars across their knuckles, in court transcripts and in the silent moments where even the loudest voices had nothing left to say. And those are the stories we're here to tell. Raymond Jury was no outsider. He wasn't someone who drifted into the Mongrel Mob looking for quick money or fleeting status. He was the kind of member who didn't need to speak to command attention. His presence carried the reputation built from decades of loyalty. Loyalty that came with broken knuckles, blood-soaked shirts, and the silence expected from those who live by their own rules. For years, Jury stood as both an enforcer and an example, a man who understood the cost of defiance and the price of keeping order when brothers turned on each other. His hands had written those lessons into the skin of men who thought the patch on their back gave them protection from consequence. And yet, for all the fear his name carried within the gang, it was the act committed inside a fellow member's home that cemented his legacy. Not as a protector of the code, but as a reminder that, in the end, no one is truly safe. January 30th, 2019, behind the walls of a house in Fatupaito, Rotorua, Raymond Jury crossed a line even the Mongrel Mob rarely forgives. He took the life of a man who wore the same colors. Trevor Rikihana wasn't an enemy. He wasn't a rival from across town. He was family, or at least, that's what the patch said he was. The fight wasn't quick. It wasn't the kind of violence that ends before a man knows it's coming. It was personal. It was deliberate. It dragged on until every plea, every gasp, and every broken breath filled that house with the sound of betrayal no one could take back. Jury's boots slammed against Rikihana's ribs, each stomp echoing off the walls. His hands gripped a hammer, swinging it down again and again until bone cracked beneath the weight of metal and fury. And even as Rikihana begged, even as he called out for mercy, the only answer was a towel twisted tight around his throat until silence swallowed him whole. For 35 minutes, the violence stretched on. Not a blind rage, not a loss of control. It was a message, a lesson, delivered one brutal second at a time. And when it was over, when the body stopped fighting back, Jury didn't bury the evidence or cover his tracks. Instead, he dragged Rikihana's lifeless body into the open, leaving it sprawled across a friend's driveway like discarded trash. There was no need to hide what had been done. In his mind, the message had already been sent, a reminder to anyone watching that loyalty means nothing when money is involved. The motive, when stripped down to its bones, was greed, a financial dispute, the kind of conflict that could have ended with words, but in a world where respect is built on fear, words are never enough. Money came first, brotherhood came second, and Trevor Rikihana paid the price for standing on the wrong side of that equation. By the time the case reached the High Court at Rotorua, the story was no longer about a single murder. It was about the fracture inside one of New Zealand's most feared gangs. It was about the truth that loyalty inside the Mongrel Mob lasts only as long as it's convenient. The courtroom itself became part of the story. When the sentence was read, life imprisonment with a minimum of 17 years, it wasn't silence that followed, it was chaos. Jury's family, his blood and his brothers in ink, erupted into a scene no judge could control. They barked, a sound that belongs to the mob alone, fists slamming against barriers, voices raised in fury, and bodies lunging toward the man who once stood as their protector. Security dragged them back, but the message was clear. In the eyes of some, Raymond Jury wasn't a murderer. He was a man who did what had to be done. To others, he was a traitor, a man who broke the only rule that mattered: never take out your own. Raymond Jury's name became more than a patch, more than ink across his skin. It became a warning, a reminder that even within the mob, the greatest threat often comes from the man standing next to you. Should loyalty within gangs matter more than personal gain? Or does survival make its own rules? Let me know what you think in the comments. Because while Raymond Jury's story ended inside a prison cell, the next man's story didn't need violence to leave its mark. His power came from something much harder to control: influence. Harry Tam's story doesn't begin in the back of a police car or inside a gang pad surrounded by barking brothers and flashing colors. His life started in a small family diner tucked into the streets of Wellington, a business run by his Chinese parents who worked every hour they could to keep food on the table and hope alive. From the outside, his childhood didn't fit the script most expect from a lifelong Mongrel Mob member. There were no gang patches on the walls, no bruises from older brothers teaching hard lessons, no police at the door before the sun came up. What Harry Tam had was something far less visible, but just as powerful: a front row seat to what it meant to be seen as different. Growing up Chinese in New Zealand wasn't always easy. In a country where your face could make you a target long before you spoke a word, Tam learned that survival wasn't always about fists. Sometimes survival meant understanding how the system worked and knowing how to push back against it. At Rongotai College, he wasn't the loudest in the room, but the lessons he learned came from more than textbooks. Teachers like Bill Mo, a Burmese immigrant who knew firsthand what it meant to stand on the outside looking in, handed him books by Karl Marx and sparked a fire that never went out. By the time he was a teenager, Tam was drawn into activism: anti-Vietnam War protests, Maori rights movements, marches filled with voices demanding change, not asking for permission. That hunger for justice, for recognition, led him to the Maori activist group Ngā Tamatoa. It was through them that he stepped into a world he never fully left: the Mongrel Mob. It started with small things, helping find places for younger members to sleep when they had nowhere else to go, making sure boys too young to be called men had someone watching their back. One step led to another, and before long, Tam wasn't standing on the edges of the mob, he was inside it, patched, recognized, respected. Over time, that respect grew into something few could claim: a lifetime membership. But what made Tam different wasn't the ink or the patch, it was what he did after. While most members buried themselves deeper into the gang world, Tam walked into government offices with the same face that wore the mob patch, now seated at tables where policy was written. He worked for the Dunedin City Council, became a trade union delegate, then found his way into the Ministry of Youth Affairs, holding a position most would never expect a Mongrel Mob member to occupy: a government advisor. That double life was no secret. He never hid his past, never denied where he came from. Instead, he used it. When policy meetings turned into academic debates disconnected from reality, Tam spoke from the ground level. He knew what it meant to see boys fall into gangs, not because they craved crime, but because they craved belonging. As co-director of Hard to Reach, Tam built a bridge few knew how to cross. He worked to mediate disputes between rival gangs. He wrote cultural reports for courts, detailed breakdowns of how upbringing, culture, and trauma led to the choices men made. Reports that, in some cases, led to reduced sentences. But it was his involvement in securing government funding for a Mongrel Mob-led meth rehabilitation program that set off a public storm. Millions poured into a program run by the very organization linked to fueling the meth crisis in the first place. Critics called it a betrayal of every family destroyed by the drug. Supporters argued it was the only way to reach those too deep inside the cycle to trust anyone outside of it. That controversy, that line between rehabilitation and enabling, followed Tam everywhere. To some, he was a voice for reform, proving that no man is only his worst choice. To others, he was a symbol of the very system they believed had been corrupted, a man who wore both the patch of a criminal organization and the suit of a government official. The question that hung over his head never faded: Can a man who lived inside the mob ever fully leave it behind, even if his intentions are honest? Or does every handshake come with the shadow of the fist that once broke bones to keep order? Should governments work with gangs to tackle addiction, or does it risk empowering organized crime? Let me know what you think, because while Harry Tam's influence reached into parliament buildings and courtrooms, the next man's battle wasn't waged with policies or funding. His fight started in the same place his addiction did, deep inside his own skin. In 2016, Dennis McCallio stopped running from the truth and decided to face it head-on. With the help of his wife Liz, he created something no one saw coming, a campaign called P-Pull. It wasn't backed by million-dollar grants or shiny slogans crafted by ad agencies. It was built the same way Dennis had lived his life, raw, unpolished, straight from the gut. P-Pull started as a Facebook group, a place for anyone caught in meth's grip to speak the truth without shame. Within months, more than 7,000 people joined, addicts, parents, siblings, neighbors, all spilling the stories they once carried alone. It didn't stop online. Dennis stood in front of packed halls, facing families who lost children, mothers who hadn't slept in days, and addicts who barely had the strength to stand. He spoke without filters, without excuses. He told them exactly how it felt to wake up craving something you hate. He told them what it meant to feel your body rot while your mind begged for one more hit. He told them what it's like to feel dead while your heart still beats. And when politicians showed up, when they took their seats at the back of those rooms, wearing polite smiles and holding folders they'd forget on the way out, Dennis didn't hold back. He called them out face to face. He reminded them how many years had passed while they talked and studied and promised change. All the while, meth tore through neighborhoods, turning homes into battlefields and children into orphans. He stood in those rooms, not as a preacher, not as a politician, but as living proof that survival was possible. And yet, even with the praise that followed, even with the headlines calling him a reformed leader, not everyone believed his story. Some saw him as a hero, a man who walked through hell and came out willing to drag others back into the light. Others saw him as something far less noble, a lifelong gang member who helped build the very meth empire he claimed to fight. Can someone inside a gang truly lead change, or will the past always follow them? Share your opinion in the comments. Because Dennis McCallio's fight took him to community halls and online groups, but our next figure didn't need a microphone to make an impact. His leadership didn't come from speeches, it came from the way he rebuilt an entire chapter, one decision at a time. Sonny Fatupaito never set out to rewrite the story of the Mongrel Mob. He didn't walk into the gang with plans for leadership or visions of changing how the world saw them. He entered the same way so many others did, through blood, loyalty, and the understanding that survival meant belonging to something bigger than yourself, even if that something demanded everything you had. Over 3 decades inside the Mongrel Mob, Sonny Fatupaito earned his place not with speeches or empty promises, but with the same fists, scars, and silence that built the foundation of the gang itself. His loyalty held even when it led to a prison cell where 6 years behind bars for manslaughter carved deeper lessons into a life already filled with consequences. But when Sonny stepped out of that cell, the world outside had changed. The Mongrel Mob wasn't the same gang it was when he first patched in. The violence was still there, but so were the cracks. Broken families, generations swallowed by meth, headlines that turned their colors into a symbol of destruction instead of survival. When COVID swept through New Zealand, bringing lockdowns, isolation, and uncertainty, it was the Mongrel Mob Kingdom under Sonny's leadership that organized vaccination drives. Not for headlines, not for favors, but because survival had always been the gang's currency, and in that moment, survival meant protecting their communities, whether they wore the patch or not. Under Sonny, the Mongrel Mob Kingdom even broke its own history, creating an all-female chapter. Women, long seen as outsiders in the gang world, were given their own space within the kingdom. It was a decision that didn't sit well with everyone. Old rules run deep and change rarely comes without friction. But not all the fractures came from within. Outside the walls Sonny was trying to rebuild, law enforcement kept watching. They saw the community work, they heard the public speeches, but they also followed the money. They followed the drugs, and in their eyes, the Kingdom chapter was still tied to methamphetamine manufacturing, a connection Sonny denied, even as the evidence piled up around them. Putawa Kirika, better known as Puk, never planned on becoming a public figure. The life he lived inside the Mongrel Mob wasn't meant for cameras, interviews, or viral headlines. It was meant for loyalty, survival, and the kind of reputation that followed you long before anyone knew your name. For years, Puk stood as captain of the Notorious chapter, fully patched, fully committed, fully aware that the life he chose would close more doors than it ever opened. There were no half measures, no second chances. Once you gave yourself to the Mongrel Mob, you were expected to belong to it, through every fight, every arrest, every funeral. But even inside that world, even with brothers beside him and a reputation that carried weight on the streets, something shifted. It didn't happen all at once. It was the slow, steady realization that the life he was living wasn't the one he wanted his children to inherit. The first time Puck looked at his children and saw the future they might face, the gang tattooed across his skin felt heavier than it ever had before. Loyalty to the mob had kept him breathing, but loyalty to his family demanded something much harder, letting go of the only life he'd ever known. Walking away from the Mongrel Mob wasn't as simple as removing a patch or changing a phone number. The ink across his face, the word notorious, stretched from cheek to cheek, made sure of that. That tattoo had once been a badge of pride, a declaration that no matter where he stood, everyone would know who he was and where he belonged. But outside the gang, it became something else. It turned job interviews into interrogations. It turned strangers' glances into silent judgments. It turned every new beginning into a reminder of a past that refused to fade. Each man carried the Mongrel Mob on his shoulders in different ways, some with fists, some with words, some with silence. But every one of them stood at the intersection of survival and consequence, a place where loyalty is currency, violence is language, and the cost of leaving is higher than most are willing to pay. Every tattoo tells a story, but the ink only shows the surface. The truth runs much deeper. If you found this story compelling, hit the like button to support the channel. Subscribe for more deep dives into crime stories you won't see anywhere else. And before you go, leave a comment. Do you believe real change is possible for gangs like the Mongrel Mob? Or does the past always find a way back?